So this panel that we have together today, we're going to talk about MLOps tooling. And so the background is we keep hearing from colleagues and friends in the industry that data science and machine learning, in some ways, a lot harder today than it feels like it was maybe a decade ago. And the thing that we keep hearing is we're constantly inundated with new MLOps tools and data tools. It can be really difficult to navigate all of these things and figure out which ones are right for you. And what we have today is a panel, an all-star panel of data scientists and people who build tools as well. And all of these people have, at some point in their careers, have been hands-on data scientists or engineers in the trenches. And they've all experienced the pain of kind of operationalizing data and ML products. And what we're hoping to do is kind of talk about these various issues and opportunities with these explosion of tools and like how to navigate that, how to think about it. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Brian was not able to be with us today because he's sick. So I'll start with Lindsay. So Lindsay, I met her at Airbnb, and she's definitely one of the most impressive people I've ever met. She did a lot of different things at Airbnb. She touched almost every area of data science I can think of. So she worked on engagements, notifications, booking, conversions, sign up, login. She worked on international growth, and like a lot of product analytics in general. And she's been hands-on with probably the largest breadth of disciplines in data science I can think of. So she's worked a lot on experimentation and analytics. She's done machine learning as well. Most people only kind of get a chance to work in one of those, but she's actually worked across a lot of them. And then recently she found Iggy, which is a company to make location-based data accessible to everybody. And I think it's really interesting. I find Lindsay's path to be extremely interesting. She kind of worked on such a wide range of data products, but she gravitated back towards what I think is kind of one of the most important parts is having high quality data. And I think this is one of the things that's like really underlooked or underappreciated, especially when building ML tooling and kind of building your ML stack, that people don't talk about that, but it's actually the bottleneck that I personally encounter. And also just like the company she found to kind of work on geospatial data, I personally, always find that I'm lacking quality geospatial data. So I'm really excited that she's on this panel. The second person is Zander. So I also worked with Zander at GitHub. He actually built a lot of the tools for ML and analytics there. He has a crazy amount of technical experience across lots of different infrastructure. It's surprising, like he's kind of a Swiss Army knife in terms of ML and tooling. He's one of the best engineers and people I ever worked with. And it's hard to categorize him as a specific type of person just because he does so many different things. So now he's a CEO of Bytewax, which is a really cool platform for streaming data. And it's also open source, so you can check it out. And yeah, what I really like about Zander is he has a lot of empathy for the data scientists, being one himself previously, and it shows up in the way he builds tools. And then the last person that I want to introduce, last but not least, is Jeremy Lewi. I met Jeremy while doing open source work on ML tooling. Jeremy co-founded and was the technical leader for Kubeflow at Google, which is one of the most popular machine learning infrastructure tools in use today. Jeremy eventually moved on from Google to lead ML infrastructure at Primer, a company. If you're not familiar with Primer, it offers kind of AI platforms, especially for NLP. And then recently, Jeremy left Primer to explore other areas with respect to ML tooling, like federated learning, and he's currently building his own thing right now. Okay, so kind of just to kick this off a bit, and feel free to just kind of chime in at any time. So my first question is, there's so many different kinds of solutions, like point solutions. When we talk about tooling, like all of you folks have built tools, and are building tools. So like there's so many things that you have to think about, like orchestrators, feature stores, metric stores, data labeling, model monitoring, surveying, like reverse ETL, experiment tracking. It just keeps going on and on. And so a lot of people are overwhelmed by all of these things. And like they're also being told implicitly, and many times, like if you're not using like many of these things, you're doing it wrong. And so how do you begin to navigate the space of this tooling if you're trying to build ML infrastructure? Like, how do you even begin to think about all this stuff? Feel free to. Okay, I'll choose Lindsay to go first.
Wow, it's a big question, and this. I think I'm like kind of hesitating to share this answer, but I'll just go for it. And I mean, you know me, so this won't be a surprise. But I mean, for me, it's always problem centric, right? Like, I feel like there's often like okay, well, we need ML. Well, okay, let's take a step back. What's the problem you're trying to answer, right? How is that problem necessarily suited to machine learning, right? Like, this is a very simple thing to ask, but I think you're absolutely right in that there is so much pressure, buzzwords, all this whole ecosystem that we all work in, live in, make our careers out of, puts a lot of expectations and pressure on us often to jump to solutions that are like way too complicated for the problem. So, I could go on and on about that, but I'll stop there because I'm intrigued to hear what others have to say. So for me, it's just like, first of all, take a step back, define the problem that you're trying to solve, rather than looking for a solution to solve a problem that you haven't defined. So yeah, throwing that out there.
I'll add to that. I think when you're picking a tool for an organization, I think it helps to try to understand like how far you can push an organization and in what directions. So, typically anytime you introduce some new tool in an organization, you need to get adoption, and you will probably face some form of uphill adoption, and people often want to roll their own. So I think understanding, in what directions you can, push folks. So as an example, we were trying to adopt an ETL tool, and we were looking at various ETL tools and trying to figure out what data processing framework would work best. And I think if you look at it, right, like traditionally the ETL frameworks were written in Java, and if you have a Java framework, they're often much better at scale and in performance. But we were a Python shop, and like pushing folks to adopt Java just did not seem like a tractable proposition. So I think that knowing those like really constrains the space, because as soon as you start, we're like, okay, I need a Python ETL framework, suddenly the space gets a lot narrower and becomes easier to decide.
I'll also maybe build on what Jeremy was saying, but first I wanted to say thank you for the sales pitch on Bytewax. Go check it out if you're a Python shop. So I mean, what I want to build on is just like that organizational piece. Machine learning often comes in as like a optimization or like a force multiplier, and it's maybe not the first thing that you use to solve your problem. Maybe coming back to what Lindsay said as well. And so the organization has probably developed all sorts of like operational maturity, practices, et cetera. And I think that's what is really important is looking at those and using those, because at the end of the day, MLOps, some of it is around like operational maturity. It's like, how can you now run and use this thing at scale and understand it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would always try and look at what your organization is already using and how, if you're bringing in new tools, how they will fit into the organization, to kind of minimize, blowback of choosing something that ends up in like, the scope just blows out and you have this huge maintenance burden, et cetera. Yeah, I don't know. That's what I'll say.
That's really interesting. I guess to kind of build on this question is, okay, let's say you figured out, and I love the Lindsay's point about asking if ML is even needed. I really love that. As my also, I love to ask people this question. But once you figure out, once you, let's say, decide that, okay, ML is needed, and after you map out these constraints, it still feels like there's tons of tools, and it's pretty crazy. And people, even if you look at a point solution, even like experiment tracking systems, for example, there's quite a few of those. And then so a lot of people ask me, how do you navigate that space? Do you just try all of them? Is there a way to think about that? Should you sort of try to buy more of how do you think about monoliths versus point solutions? And I guess a related question is that may be helpful is, what mistakes have you seen people make when, trying to select tools or build tools, having built tools and having done this yourself in organizations?
I guess I can go first. I think a good way to get started is trying to understand where you are in your ML AI journey. And I think for me, a key sort of distinction is, have you proven yet that ML can sort of impact key business metrics and are sort of critical to the business, right? So I think in certain industries like video, if you're doing any sort of recommendation engine for e-commerce or videos or music, I think it's pretty clear that without ML and recommendations to power discovery, like your ability to drive traffic and make revenue is not going to work very well. So it's crazy. I think it's already common practice that like you need those components, and therefore you're going to invest heavily in making them work well. I think in a lot of places where ML is more on the frontier, it's not proven that ML can impact the business yet. So, and I think if you're at that point where you haven't proven that ML can impact the business, then I think that's the problem you need to focus on, and then that probably affects the decisions about which tools and problems you need to solve, because you don't want to over-engineer things. And I think there's a lot of people talk about drift detection, for example, but if your models aren't impacting the business, then does drift detection matter? Because it's not gonna if your model's performing worse, it doesn't matter, right? So I think that's really helpful. And then based on that, you can decide what you're optimizing for, right? So if you're trying to prove ML is going to impact the business, you probably want to optimize for velocity. And then once you've proven that, then that's how you can make the justification for doing further investment to improve and refine and track.
So one question I have about this, that's a good point, is this chicken and egg problem that we always get into is, like ML on the frontier, there's a lot of businesses that want to use ML that hasn't necessarily proven it. I would say most businesses are like this in some sense. And then, the argument always, the data scientist lands, the ML person lands and says, oh, wow, there's no tooling. I need some tooling. And then the business says, well, prove it first. And it's this vicious cycle. How do you think about that? That comes up a lot. Anyone can answer the question if you want. So feel free to.
We've probably all been in some sort of situation that is like this. And I think it comes down for the willingness for the business to take a risk on it. If it's brand new, it's like a research and development area. So is the business one that they're willing to spend money on this sort of research development to get potentially incremental gains or no gains? If it's a proven path, then I think that there should be some way to, show up with an argument that there will be ROI and that you should have some budget for tooling and a team, et cetera.
I want to jump in here in that like, this is how new companies are born, right? Like, Iggy came out of my experience at Airbnb and a lack of tooling for what I considered to be a really big problem, which, now 2 years after I've left, Airbnb has also realized that and, released a product very much in the realm of like the tooling that I have gone on to create at Iggy and that I wanted to create at Airbnb. So, this is a bit of a broader answer in that I think we often just think about career success or success in our roles in terms of like these narrow lanes, which could very well be like this chicken and egg problem. And for some people, success is, yes, convincing leadership that like, here's how we do it. Another path, obviously I'm very biased here, but another path to success is building a company around it, right? And I know that the market is changing, but it's still a very generous time in terms of taking some of these risks around, around some of these ideas.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think the thing that I would add is like, while I think the ecosystem of tools is still evolving and immature in certain areas, in other areas it's fairly mature, right? Like compared to a couple of 5 years ago, where getting a GPU is really hard. Getting a GPU these days is fairly easy, assuming you have access to one of the public clouds, which I think most companies probably do, right? So I think if you look at most of the public clouds, like you have a lot of hosted services for the core building blocks of getting started with data science, whether it's running a notebook, getting a GPU, deploying a model, auto ML services, natural language services, et cetera. So I think, if you haven't proven out ML yet or at your organization, I would say you probably don't need to be building your own tools. You should probably be focused on like what tools can I use out of the box, and how can I just make them work and build something quick to prove the value.
Yeah. That's a great point, and I think as well, the fragmentation of the landscape is real and it is overwhelming, as Hamel said. And I think, we all have to do our own research, right? Like, to a certain extent about, where to start given what's out there. And, this is more related to like go-to-market strategies of many of these younger startups and some of these companies. Is like, it does make a difference when you can like get started on your own, right? I put that very much in the realm of this sort of research. Hamel, do you try everything? Probably not, but like, there's amazing data communities on Slack, on Twitter, where you can get some purchase about where to start. And of course, there's always bias there, so you have to root through it. But I do think there is something quite remarkable about some of these go-to-market models, which are now very common, right? That allow us as ICs to make purchase on, there's a pun there that wasn't intended, but like, make progress in terms of some of these areas of work before, in order to help convince an organization. So I don't know, it's kind of an exciting time in terms of that, like how much you can, do as an IC to help your cause here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that you mentioned kind of this other career path, like when you notice a problem. I think, we have all of us on this call here have done that. And it makes a lot of sense. One interesting question that's a little bit unrelated is, what are some areas where you think there are a dearth of tools where there's a large opportunity for tooling that you see, if any? Jeremy, I think you're smiling.
Yeah, I'm gonna shamelessly plug potentially Bytewax here. I think data processing frameworks for Python are still sort of an unsolved area in my mind, right? So I think I really liked the Spark and data flow programming model. I think that really works well when you're building a data processing workflow for shipping data. But I think it wasn't necessarily intended for Python. It was built off of the JVM, and I think when you start to run Python on top of that, it has some problems, and certainly has some operational complexity. But I also think like and oftentimes when you're building data processing pipelines these days, you're calling out to external services or models, and also doing long running operations, and that's not what those frameworks were intended for, and you start to see that create operational problems for you. So I think that to me is one area where I see some opportunity.
Thank you. I think one other area where I see some opportunity is based on what we're working on at Bytewax. So right now, if you're using SQL to do any of your data transformations, it's super portable, and there's such a great decoupling. You can write ANSI type based SQL, and you can run it virtually anywhere, and you don't have this sort of runtime environment problem when you're running or you're executing code. You end up running into a lot more problems with managing your runtime environment. You have this sort of runtime problem, and it hasn't been solved that well. Of course, you can always say, like put it in a Docker container and then run it on some container service, or just set up Kubernetes, but it's still a whole lot harder than SQL. And so I think there's still opportunity there, and I don't know where WebAssembly will end up going to address this. If it does, I'm sure this will be something in the future that some of the bigger data vendors potentially allow you to run code closer to the data or something like that, and kind of solve that runtime and problem for us. And it comes back to like the long running services. We have so many great tools for like running batch things or running short services or web services, but like anything in between doesn't work out that well. So I think that's maybe an opportunity.
Yeah, for me, not a surprise. It's all about the data. I think that most of us here and probably in the audience have, at least heard of or follow along with like data-centric AI approach now, which is like, for me, is like so welcome because, we have made so much progress on certain like mechanistic aspects of AI and ML. But to my mind, at the end of the day, like, we're barely scratching the surface in terms of the data that we can bring to our models, and even the models we have of our models, and how we think about whether it's probabilistic processes or other processes in the world. And so the thing that like really makes me smile in a panel like this is you always just feel like you're amongst friends, and that the way that we experience the world is always similar to one another, in that like we're frustrated by inefficiencies, we're frustrated by how hard certain things are, and for me, again, it's like how it's so hard to get particularly geospatial data, not just into models, into products. And so I get really excited, and of course that's what I'm building my company around, is like, how do we make that part so much easier, right? Like there is so much data out there in the world, as we all know. It's scattered. I always give this example with geospatial, like, imagine if the monthly jobs report was in a format that like a small segment of people could understand. Like, that is not the world that I want. And yet that is the world that exists when, this is a bit of a niche, but like, when so much of what I'll call like geospatial data is in, there's no common formats, right? There are proprietary formats. So obviously, plug in my own company here, Iggy, but I think there's so much potential, right, to help not just data scientists, as I mentioned, get more and better data into their models, but really anyone across the product spectrum.
Yeah, it would be amazing as a data scientist to kind of have the data acquisition to be made a lot easier. I'm really curious, is there any other types of data enrichment sort of opportunities out there beyond geospatial that you have come across, like that might be interesting for people that are interested in this, kind of data this kind of building more tools like Iggy?
Oh man, that's a great question. And I'm so focused on geospatial. It's like my whole mind is overtaken with geospatial. I mean, it is obviously a very general problem though, right? I think there's a very general problem in terms of access to data. I think like geospatial formats make it quite difficult. Like, one of the challenges is joins, right? Like joins are uniquely difficult in ways that with other types of data we've solved. So I'm curious to hear what if other people have thoughts there.
I mean, I think a question that I've been sort of asking myself lately is why isn't there sort of, more structured data published on the web, right? So I think like if you look at the typical website, right, it's sort of published and formatted with the expectation of being read by humans, even though so much of the time we would rather consume that data in bulk via machines, right? So like most companies have lists of their products, employees, et cetera, right? That would be very useful if that was published in a more machine readable and structured format that made it sort of easy to like index and surface that information. But instead it's not. And, instead the sort of trend right now is like, well, we're going to throw some really large natural language understanding model at it. Right. And it's interesting, I think, because like just from like a cost perspective, if you think about doing that at web scale, like that's not cost effective right now. So I think that's something that's interesting to me is like, why isn't there more structured data on the web?
I love that, especially given how much, as you know, like how much time we spend in creating structure out of unstructured data. Yeah. Are there any models for that we should, like, I'm trying to think about, like, yeah, what gives us hope or models, what should be done
for that particular problem? I mean, to me, I think it seems more like an incentive and an alignment problem, because, right, like the technology has been around for like decades, like the semantic web, right? We're just not using it. And, and a lot of that information probably comes from structured databases, right? Like a CSV table or a content management system somewhere. Or there's the incentives right now are like misaligned, right? Like we're still sort of back in the days where we thought our web pages were only going to be read by humans, right? And so, the biggest incentive right now is search ranking, right? So it's like if Google says do X and you'll be ranked higher, like people will do it, but it's potentially other incentives.
Yeah, it's wild that you say that because, again, I'll talk less about Iggy, but I think about the problem of maps the same way, right? Like we've incentivized, and this is of course related to Google and their dominance, but like incentivize like getting data on maps and a visual experience of data that we like. Where is it coming from? It's always coming from a database, right? It's there somewhere. So yeah, that's an interesting connection.
Okay. For the next question, I'm going to show you folks like 4 images and then have you react to them. So let me.
Is this a psychological experiment?
Kind of. Yes. Okay. So the first one is the one that you might be familiar with. This is from the Hidden Technical Data Machine Learning Systems. And basically what it's trying to show is in the middle, there's kind of ML code, which is what we talk about a lot as an industry. But then, what in reality is there's so much other things going on around ML that kind of, make the actual ML code feel really insignificant. And I think this resonates with most people. I think this diagram has kind of been accepted as sort of a shared understanding amongst data professionals. But then this is the next slide. This is where it starts to become slightly more, overwhelming. And so this is Matt Turk's, sort of infographic of all the different tools and kind of categorize them in a lot of different space. And like the first thing that at least for me and anyone else I talk to, when they see this, it's pretty overwhelming. You have to have like a microscope just to read anything. and it just hits you in the face as this magic or this gigantic tidal wave of tools, and kind of this taxonomy of things that you may want to be aware of. And then this paper came out recently and has been making the rounds. This is kind of a end-to-end flow chart of the machine learning process. And also, I would say, so this is quite detailed. And of course, the debate about this chart has been kind of twofold. On one side, people have said, okay, yeah, there's machine learning is complicated and requires a lot of different things. So, this flowchart is accurate. And then the other side of the debate is, oh, wow, like, are we making things a bit too complicated in terms of, is the discourse around what we, how to set up ML, is it too complicated in general? Like, are we showing people, do we tend to show people more complicated things, or do we bias that way? And then this is another Venn diagram. There's been so many Venn diagrams, but this is the newest one. For me personally, I think this is kind of overwhelming. I mean, you might as well just I can simplify this diagram for myself in saying, well, there's just a circle of somebody that just knows everything in the world. That's the way I feel when I look at this. But, in some ways, you can argue to pull off data science or ML, successful ML projects. Yeah, it is a team effort. But on the same token, the ways that this is being communicated in the industry right now is, hey, like, we want people to be skilled in all this in these areas. That there is significant discourse around, hey, like, you should learn all of these things. So I want to stop there and kind of flip it back to you folks to kind of get your reactions on all of those things and your kind of how you feel about these various messages.
The first thing is clear is there were all those founders that started companies in the second slide clearly were having the problem in 2015. And so over the next 7 years, they all left and started companies. And then we ended up with that new graphic. I know, it's super overwhelming. I don't spend my days as an IC doing in that space right now. And it's just so overwhelming. I actually am thankful that I don't have to be like drinking out of a fire hose every other day, or that's what it would feel like to me.
Do you feel like we're overcomplicating things at all? Like, do you feel like the discussion and the discourse around it tends to bias people towards talking about more complicated things to the point where we don't show how to do things in a kind of a pragmatic way? Or what is your feeling in general?
I think we maybe ended up here, and then I'll stop talking to the others. Ended up here because of a bunch of reasons. There's no like single reason. It's a complex process. There were people who were involved who maybe weren't involved in other parts of software engineering, and so they didn't bring some of the tools that already existed. We were in a time where funding was relatively cheap. Money was cheap for a long time. It was easy to start a company, and there was a ton of hype around machine learning, and we were at that right point in the hype cycle, and we were now still in the right, moment of the hype cycle for data, where there's just this perfect convergence of, and it almost feels like a natural thing where we'll have this explosion of tools, and then some will, because of what's happening in the world and just the points of the cycle we're at, from economic to software development, et cetera, we'll have things die off and then aggregate or in some way, shape, or form. So it's, I don't know. Like, there's no simple answer for how we ended up here today, I don't think.
I actually see a disconnect between the diagrams in that, so the fragmented landscape, right? Like, super overwhelming. Every time I try to look at that, I just give up. There is that, and that is true. part of me is like, and this shouldn't be a surprise given one of my previous answers, like choice should be good, right? Like all of us should appreciate choice. And maybe it's a beautiful thing that there are so many options because it is I find it easier to do these things today than it was 5 years ago. That is progress. Now, do I have to like make more choices? Yes. But I think optionality is really good. So that's sort of the second diagram. And then I can't remember which one it was, maybe the Venn diagram. Like the Venn diagram to me is frustrating because it's just a fantasy, right? And it's like when I saw this, I'm thinking about like our experiences at Airbnb. There's a massive hit by a bus factor in the middle of that circle, right? And like everyone wants that person. I would never want to be that person. I mean, maybe you like, make a lot of money in the meantime, but like everyone wants that person in the middle of the Venn diagram. But come on, like who are we kidding? And if we want that, then I actually think we're ignoring the previous diagram, which suggests that it's the tools that connect the different circles, right? And it's not to say that that's not difficult. It's not to say that there aren't a lot of choices, but the Venn diagram, we went through it with data science. Of course, we're going through it with machine learning. It's more of a reflection of a fantasy of how, you want a single person to be able to do all of these things when I think this is why we create tools. So you don't have to have a single person, creating all of these things. So would love pushback on that, of course.
Jeremy, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of these diagrams, maybe particularly like 3 and 1, I think there's some important context here. And I think a lot of times they speak to maturity of an organization, where they are with their organization, where in their journey, right? I think a lot of times these diagrams come from organizations which are very mature in their use of AI, and they're showing where they got to, after years of investment, right? And that's probably not where they started, right? Like, so, I worked at YouTube on video recommendations, right? And that system today is highly optimized. There's like multiple teams building tools, infrastructure, optimizing everything from, the logging pipeline to how models get built, making it easy to run experiments, everything. But that's not how it started, right? Like, I mean, the common knowledge that people sort of promulgated at Google was, when you get started with AI, like, don't start with a complicated model. Try to find the simplest heuristic that you think will get you some benefit, and sort of build the end-to-end system around that, and then kind of iterate, right? And so I think like early iterations around video recommendations at YouTube were just based off of like, popular videos and things like that. And then it sort of went from there to, okay, how do we get more diversity? Then it's like, what metrics can we optimize for? And it's like, well, we can optimize for clicks because we have that data. And then we were like, well, that's not the right metric to optimize for. We should optimize for watch time. Well, how do we optimize for watch time? Well, that ended up being like a 2-year investment in like, the logging pipeline and front end code in order to collect those metrics and, feed them into the training and serving. So I think that's the context that I think people might be missing when they get this diagram. Like if you're just trying to like optimize your ticket flow or something else to sort of reduce toil, building all of this is probably not necessarily the what to start with on day 0.
That makes sense. And I guess my question is, do you think that there's not as much discussion about, let's say, the how to do things when you're starting out? There's definitely a lot of things how to do stuff when you're like kind of at stage 0. Like how do you train a model in a notebook, or how do you serve something with SageMaker? But like kind of this middle ground, do you feel like there's enough discourse around that, or if that's well represented at all?
I mean, my initial reaction to that is like, to me that speaks more to a type of person than particular tools, skill sets, or other things, right? So I've seen some people be really, really good at this, and they're just like, capable of taking a problem and sort of understanding and grabbing, all kinds of different things, models, infrastructure, building front ends, everything, in order to get it done and build that end-to-end prototype, and also just kind of pushing through obstacles as they encounter them, right? And so it's a very different type of mentality and skill set, I think, to sort of thinking through like, okay, what's the right way to design this, and how do I build for the long term versus sort of like hacking things together and really getting that end-to-end system together. So, personally, I'm pretty in awe of those folks because I don't think that's my skill set, but I also don't know how to, what advice to get other than sort of like recognize those people and like grab them when you see them.
I see. Okay, so like this kind of dovetails into the next question is, okay, so all you are building tools right now of one kind or the other, of ML tools. So how do you build tools in this environment? Like, this thing, it's overwhelming, you have lots of noise, it's crowded. How do you position your tools? Like, how do you think about this, kind of in this, given what we just observed?
I can take a stab at it, unless you guys, Lindsay, Zander, you want to go? I mean, my general thinking was like, the first distinction to make is whether you're strategically, you're sort of going broad or deep. So I think like if you think about SageMaker, Cloud Vertex AI, and I'm not sure what Microsoft calls it, it's AI platform, or trying to build like the entire end-to-end workflow for AI. So it's like one-stop shop, right? So I think that's increasingly a difficult proposition for a startup to do, right? Because it just requires so much investment, and the existing incumbents are like far ahead at this point, right? So the other approach I think is to go, deep in a particular area. I feel like this is how weights and biases started, with the experiment tracking, model monitoring piece, right? And sort of understand where is there a gap and a need, and then trying to build the tool for that gap and need.
Yeah, I almost think that only those large clouds are capable of starting with a vision that is like an end-to-end vision, because they just they have the resources, and they already have probably the audience. I think the generic, you should ask me this in another few years if Bytewax either succeeds or fails, but the generic advice of like Jeremy was saying is build to a need, and also to find a niche or an area where you can really focus and serve the hair on fire customer seems to be the generic business advice that probably fills here too.
Yeah, I feel like I have to go generic too, but so often overlooked. It's of course related to the hair on fire problem, but it's like listening. I think all of us are makers, right? We're all builders. That's what binds us together in so many ways. And we get really excited when we're building things and they work. And that is exciting. It's great. And that experience of like getting something in front of a customer, getting feedback, and it can be positive feedback, it can be negative feedback, but like I feel like often what you build is the excuse for like the conversation that you should be having regardless. That conversation that's like, here's what we're really struggling with, and I just, again, it's like so generic, but like that is so critical is like that experience of like actually listening to folks, and it can lead you to paths that you didn't expect, but like really getting into the nitty gritty of like what frustrates them, keeps them up at night. It's how how I started on this panel was like problem orientation, right? But like what really try to understand problems first, seems to be the way to go about it.
That makes sense. And I guess just one question came to my mind based on Lindsay's observation that there's a career path for a lot of people to build data tools. I mean, that resonates with me. I got frustrated and I also started building data tools. And so what are some lessons you have learned, like while building tools? For example, is there certain aspects you would have focused on more or less? Like if you're like maybe building the next tool with the benefit of some hindsight, like for example, like, would you focus on some aspect more like marketing or community or documentation or something like that? It would be interesting to hear, like from as tool builders, like what kind of advice you have for people wanting to maybe build tools now.
I think building an open core business is really hard. And so I think I think building non-open source tools is also very hard. So I think if you're thinking about building a tool and you think about building it open source, I think there's an inherent advantage if you can do that at a company that has the business model that can support investments in open source, which are sort of limited to a couple really big companies, right? I think if you are building an open source tool or infrastructure, I think you kind of want to, if you're building a standalone company, I think you want to start to think about first, what's your business strategy, and then think about like, does being open accelerate that strategy, and making some decisions to serve that business strategy. I think otherwise that can be a genie that's hard to put back in the bottle later on. So
genie putting back in the bottle in terms of, hey, like you already made it open source. Maybe that wasn't the best strategy, but you can't really reverse that easily.
I mean that, but also like other decisions, even if you are open core, like I think a big one, if you're thinking about open source, is what type of open source project are you going to build? Like, are you going to be sort of a community-led open source project where, there's lots of stakeholders and decision makers, or is it going to be open source, but, it's going to be sort of tightly controlled and by a single company, right? And I think if you make sort of an implicit commitment to be a community-led project, and then you want to reverse that later on because that doesn't align with the business strategy, that's going to be very costly in terms of credibility and mind share. So I think that's the kind of things you want to think through and get right first off, because I think reversing course later on can really be difficult.
And like, just to drill into that more, that's very interesting. I mean, like, what are some considerations that you have, like, when deciding that? Because I feel like everybody kind of thinks about that, at least when they're building tools. Like, hey, should this be open source? Maybe it shouldn't be open source. Just given the prevalence of open source right now, I feel like that's something that weighs on people.
I can just speak to how we thought about it. Is open source is a go-to-market strategy, and so it's essentially at the top of our funnel. What we have been trying to do is make it as easy as possible for someone to get started. So you can, pip install Bytewax and get going. And what are the various ways we can do that? It could be a hosted thing, or it could be open source. And then if we look at some of the requirements of the users, oftentimes there's data privacy and security concerns. So maybe the hosted thing is actually more of a barrier, so it's not as easy to use. So it made sense from that perspective, ignoring some of the other complicating things that Jeremy was mentioning, to go open source so that we can have broad adoption of the tool, and we can leverage that in a way for people to get onto the product easily.
And what about open source is one thing. What about other types of dimensions when it comes to building data tools? Like, there's so many other factors, I guess, to consider if you can, other than open source or not open source. Like, is there anything else that kind of is top of mind, that sort of, mistakes that you have made, or things that you wish focused on more that, could be interesting?
I mean, I think one thing here, so you had mentioned like marketing potentially, and I mean, I guess to take a step back, it's like, we talked about tools and like starting companies. You don't always have to start a company. Lots of eventual companies come out of, side projects and other things. But I think if you are going, the startup route, I'm a former data scientist, not a marketer. And I think for many of us, like, marketing doesn't come easily. What does it even mean, right? Like, we could sort of struggle with what it means, which means it's hard to do. And if you're in a startup, you're scrappy, and founders are you have founder-led sales, and founders are the marketers in the beginning as well. And I think one thing that I struggled with early on was, like, I was very uncomfortable with marketing. Now, I also, raised a pre-seed round, like really early, pre-product. And so it's like, what am I marketing, right? Like, I don't have a product. Then you have a product, but you're kind of testing different products out. And like, I kind of felt this pressure to like talk about the product, and that's not what you should be doing at all. What I've come to understand, you talk about the problem. Again, like, I didn't plan these lines through my answers here, but like, I wish I had gotten that sooner, that it's the problem that compels people. It's the problem that gets you on. And there's like a whole theory. And of course I read this book. It just didn't like sit anywhere. It's like the theory is too serious of a word, but there's this great book I love called Play Bigger. And it's about like category defining companies, and, how I lived in DC for many years and wasn't really taking cabs, but like, Uber came along and told me how bad the experience of taking a cab was, right? Like, they weren't like, well, they were like, get in our black cars, but what they led with was, this experience is miserable, right? And so, yeah, I would definitely, I don't know if this is about giving advice or reflecting, but like, really just centering communication with the outside world, which is exactly what marketing is, like, on the problem that you're trying to solve. That's when it gets exciting. That's when people start engaging, right? And that's when they actually want to talk to you as a vendor. Like, it's very weird to me that there are people who like don't want to talk because I'm a vendor, which I obviously do not identify as such. But when you're building a company, that's like the world you operate in. But you do problem centric marketing, I guess, and I guess you're more than a vendor. We'll see.
Makes sense. Okay, my last question before we might get on to, let's say, audience questions, we might have time for one, is are there any problems that you keep seeing as you work with customers and organizations that you think are common that cannot be solved with tools that you keep running into? I mean, there's kind of a bias, I think, in some sense in tech to just try to solve everything with tools as much as possible. But just curious, what kind of, is there anything that you've observed out there that people should watch out for, sort of kind of patterns that you've seen in terms of this?
Wow, this is a can of worms, but one thing I'll share, we're living in an interesting time and place. And, a lot of people see data as the answer, like that data is, and in some ways, like that's the solve. That's like the fix that I'm selling. But like, what I want to say here, it's like, tooling to my mind cannot solve creativity or like deep thinking about a problem, about a process, about your customers. Like, we do a lot of really, close work with customers who will say to us like, well, just give us this data. And it's like, I can give you that, but like, how are you thinking about that? How are your customers thinking about this problem? How are you thinking about it? Like, what is your mental model? And And again, maybe it's because some people see us as a data vendor. They just like sometimes expect that we can like hand something over and it's going to answer their question. So I don't know. I'm like trying to avoid specifics. So maybe I'm being a little too vague, but like tooling cannot solve like a thinking problem. And that's like a very big statement, but like, I think that the scarcest skill we have has to do with like creativity, problem solving, models, not in terms of the models that we build, but models we have of the world, because that's where those models come from. So yeah, I don't really think tooling can solve that. And like, how do you find people who can work with data, but who are thinking really deeply and creatively about, you know, these processes we're all trying to understand and solve. Yeah, I'll stop there because it's a lot.
No, I like that a lot. I mean, yeah, that resonates with me in my experience as well. The people wanting some kind of data or specific solution, not thinking about the problem. Anyone else? Jeremy, Zander?
Sure. I mean, I think if you want to be effective and put ML to work, like I think the key is ML needs to sort of be, for lack of a better term, embodied, right? Like it has to be integrated into some system. So I think a good example is like GitHub Copilot, right? Like that model didn't really become useful and get traction until it got integrated into people's IDEs, right? And so to me, what I often see is like you have a highly complex system requiring specialized skill to like build the models. Then you also have a highly specialized complex system to actually integrate the model into actual products where those predictions are made useful. So to me, in order to be effective, those two groups of folks need to be collaborating and working closely and aligned. And so to me, that's like an organizational challenge. And so I think that's a problem that you can't solve with tools, right? You have to have an organizational structure that can foster that type of collaboration in order to be effective with ML.
Zander, you want to say anything? You don't have to if you don't want to, but I want to give you the
No,
chance.
I think they both made really good points. It's about organizational problems. And all I keep thinking about is this metaphor when Lindsay was speaking of like, you can have the best tools in the world, but if you don't know how to build a house, you're not going to be able to build a house. Or you can have the best skills in the world, but if you don't have the materials or the tools, you're not going to be able to build a house. And so you need to have all these things. But I don't know. I was just stuck in my head and I couldn't stop myself.
No, it's totally fine. No.
I think we should get to some of the questions.
Yeah, okay. There's a question from Saurav. He's asking, can you suggest a roadmap to get started with operationalizing ML? And I actually get this question a lot. I say, hey, is there a roadmap? And I never have a great solution to that because it's hard to have a roadmap. But I mean, you already touched on this a little bit, but does somebody want to some thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that really depends on your system or product, right? Like I think going back to what Lindsay started off with, right? It's what problem are you trying to solve, right? So are you trying to improve video recommendations, routing of support tickets, et cetera? And so I think if you haven't gotten ML, some sort of model or heuristic integrated and affecting your system, like your roadmap is what's the path to get that done for your organization, right? And so I think that's probably going to be in many ways be specific to your infrastructure and product. Like, you know, do I serve my model? Do I like integrate my model into my code? How do I pre-compute predictions? Do I have a serving infrastructure? So, but I think the goal is to like have some evidence that you can impact the business or metrics that you care about.
Makes sense. Okay, it looks like we're at time actually. So it was fun hanging out with everybody. I think it's really interesting. It may have surfaced more questions than we answered. That's probably okay. I recommend everybody in the audience to check out Bytewax and Iggy and also Kubeflow and basically stalk Jeremy, whatever he's creating next, to see what that is. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. And yeah, thank you.